All right, welcome again to the LSVW. Today we're going to be discussing the paper by Frank Martin and Jordan Ragusa titled Nothing After Newtown, Gun-Owning Members of Congress and the Gun Control Paradox. If you're interested in taking a look at the paper, it's posted on the LSVW website, lsvw.org, and you can read the paper there along with sort of listening in today and hearing the comments. So we've assembled a panel of commentators on the paper along with one of the authors, Jordan Ragusa. So we'll go down the line and sort of do some introductions here first. So if you want to start, Barry, I'll give it to you.
I'm Barry Burden at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Okay. Jason?
Jason Roberts, University of North Carolina.
Okay. Jordan?
I'm Jordan Ragusa. I'm an assistant professor at the College of Charleston.
Neil?
Neil Malhotra at Stanford.
Okay, and I'm Nate Monroe at UC Merced. I'll be moderating today. So the way this generally works is that we're going to give the author a chance to just very quickly sort of introduce the paper with no particular presentation. All of us have read the paper, and so we're going to go through and offer some feedback and discussion. We'll go through the paper sort of in order, in the following order. We'll look at the big picture sort of framing issues first, and then we'll move on to discussion of theory, and then discussion of design and empirics, and then we'll finish up with any sort of comments that don't quite fit that format or anything that anybody sort of occurred to them as we went along. And so, of course, Jordan, you can jump in as we go and offer feedback or offer responses or engage further on points that you want help on or clarification. So Jordan, I'll turn it over to you to start here, and you can give us just a little bit of sort of context for the paper, and then we'll open it up to sort of some comments on framing and big picture questions.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks to Nate and Jason for organizing this. This is a paper that I've presented at the Southern Political Science Association, and it's sort of, I think, still a little bit in the early stages. There are some things that I'm working on, but I guess a little background on where this project came from. So my co-author on this paper is actually a former undergraduate at the College of Charleston, and in 2013 he was looking for a bachelor's essay topic. He was in the college's honors college. And so he needed to write a year-long bachelor's essay, and he was interested in the politics of gun control. And we were having a conversation about why it was that in 2013 the House and Senate failed to enact stricter gun laws, despite the fact that in 2012 we had the Sandy Hook shooting, and polls showed that a lot of Americans supported some specific items that the Senate in particular voted on. So the question was, why is this happening? And I went through some of the usual explanations with him. And after I got done explaining kind of the usual suspects, he said, well, maybe there's just a lot of gun owners in Congress. And my reaction was that I thought this was a little naive. It seemed far too simple to explain this. And so I asked a sort of a question, which was, well, why do you think that there are so many gun owners in Congress? And he actually had a really smart response. He said, if you look in the population, gun owners are predominantly old white married males. That sounds like an apt description of members of Congress. So it stands to reason that maybe there's a lot of gun-owning members of Congress. And so I said, that's a very reasonable hypothesis. Now you have to collect data on gun owners in Congress. And so he did some digging, and he found that USA Today had happened to collect some data by interviewing members and asking them simply whether they owned a gun. So we used that as our initial data source. As we explained in the paper, we collected some additional data to try to fill in as many of the gaps as possible. And I guess the short end of the story is that I was wrong. Just sort of questioned that this might be a reasonable explanation for how members vote on gun control legislation. So the paper shows that gun-owning members of Congress do vote against gun control, even when we control for a range of factors. And we also show in the end that it seems to affect ultimately the outcomes that Congress passes. So yeah, I'm interested to hear your feedback on the various aspects of this paper. Thank you in advance for taking the time to read this and comment on it. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks. Anyone want to jump in with some initial comments? Neil, Barry, want to fire the first shot?
Most of my comments are kind of on design stuff, so I'll hang back until kind of you guys finish the framing stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I
Barry.
have a couple of larger framing questions, but they might be better handled at the end after we get through the empirical stuff.
Okay. Jason, anything on big picture framing questions?
Not right now, no.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. I missed that.
I don't have anything to say at this point now. I think
Okay.
framing is okay.
Okay. So I'll offer one quick framing point. So generally, I really like the framing from a. So I think often papers, maybe I don't know if it's worse in the legislative politics literature than other places, but that's just what I know. So often we struggle to sometimes I think motivate papers with things that are outside of the literature. We find sort of interesting debates that exist, and it's difficult to ground them in sort of politics that might be in a more popularly accessible way. And I think this paper in some ways has the opposite issue, right? So it's really interesting. This is sort of an interesting sort of framing and question from a popular politics standpoint, right? It's very contemporarily relevant. It has a lot of appeal. You could explain it to your Uncle Ed at Christmas, right? I mean, it has all of those great features. But I do think that there's a way to. I think what I would want to see you do is to push harder on where this makes a contribution to some of the literature on either what motivates roll call voting or thinking about the way that representation sometimes cuts across either personalistic or other motivations that that sort of drive policy outcomes, right? So there's a fair amount of work I think on what is sometimes called either private or personal interests that I think this sort of ties into nicely from a sort of just a theoretical standpoint, and it gives you more of a hook into the literature that I think might help. Not to take away from the way you frame it now, but as a way to I think get a little more purchase on where this makes a contribution in the literature. You could sort of add some of that in, I think, without taking away the more generally applicable frame. So that's my sort of thought on the framing issue.
Okay, Nate, you dragged me in. I'm gonna. I'll just offer my.
Sorry.
No, it's great. So it does have this current events focus, which I think is useful because it gets at this big puzzle of why gun laws are what they are given public opinion. But I think it also raised the puzzle in the other direction, which is why do voters let representatives vote on the basis of their gun ownership or any other personal characteristics and not penalize them for it at the ballot box? Is there a kind of blind spot on the part of voters that they don't see this happening, that gun owners are way overrepresented in the Congress and that affects their votes? And the story may be slightly different for each issue, so that's a way to sort of put it in a broader context to think about why in some circumstances legislators can get away with doing things that the public doesn't prefer, and other times they're held to account for it.
So, and let me I mean that puts it in, I think, a more specific context that I like, Barry, and let me suggest, I'm not quite sure this is an answer, but maybe even a slightly different version or a flip of that, which is one story is that legislators are making a calculation about how much they're going to be punished for different things, right? And one possibility that occurred to me is that they may be very afraid of looking like hypocrites, right? So I'm a gun-owning member of Congress and I vote for gun control, right? It may, you could imagine a story where there's a purely electoral calculation, but that electoral calculation is about the fact that I think it's worse for me to vote in a way that makes me look like a hypocrite than to vote in a way that is on this one issue out of line with what my constituents want or what I sort of espouse in sort of more general terms in some way. I'm not sure that's the answer, but I mean, I think this gets at sort of this question of like a broader theoretical question about when and how do private interests play in? Like, what's the calculation look like if I have a private interest? Is it about, do I say this private interest is something that I think of just sort of orthogonal to my electoral calculation, or am I trying to balance that all the time? So anyway, I just wonder, you know, it could be that, you know, that the punishment would be just worse if you went another route. But I like that, and I think that's a good way to ask the question: is why don't they get punished?
Okay, you got me involved too now. Is this even unique? Is there anything unique about gun control?
Yeah,
it seems to be an assumption at the beginning of the paper that Congress reflects public opinion in their policy enactments regularly. I don't necessarily think that that's true. I can think of some issues that the public overwhelmingly supports that Congress doesn't take action on. I think taxation of the wealthy is one that gets overwhelming support, and we see no movement on that, you know, very often in Congress. And I'm not sure we're supposed to expect that. I mean, you go back to May, who talks about you never get in trouble for not accomplishing something. You get in trouble for taking the wrong position on something. And so members can say whatever they want to about gun control. You know, this didn't go far enough. There was this problem with the bill, this problem with the bill. If they had passed my amendment, it would have been great, blah, blah, blah. And still say things that are pleasing without enacting or changing any status quo points. So I guess when I think about the way the lawmaking process works, I never start with the question of why didn't this change. I mean, sort of my default is things don't change, so why do things happen?
I mean, this reminds me of, I mean, to plug the LSVW further, right? This reminds me of Christian Gross and Jordan Peterson's paper that we saw, you know, a few weeks ago or a couple months ago here, where they're looking at the way that private stock portfolios drive different voting decisions, right? And that sort of private interest, and whether or not that has an effect on decisions of members of Congress. And it occurs to me that there's just a lot of policy areas where, right, this sort of comes into play, right? And members might be
just distinguish like two things. So because I think the paper doesn't have is not able to empirically distinguish these things. So there's the idea of private interest, which is the grossy type of thing, right? That's very clear. But there's also sort of like it just makes you primed and more attenuated to the concerns of the constituency. So another like paper in this literature is the Abanya Washington paper on daughters influencing the abortion roll call votes. And that paper is like masterful because the daughter and son is a randomly assigned variable. So there's no endogeneity problems. But still that paper can't disentangle whether, are you worried that your own daughter is going to have an abortion? Or are you worried that you have a daughter, so you're more concerned with women's rights and those kind of issues, right?
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments before we move off the framing? Or Jordan, do you have anything you want to say, sort of about response or encouragement on some point?
No, I mean, well, so this is really good. I mean, in terms of some of the questions about how this varies based on members' characteristics, you know, one of the suggestions that I've received on this paper is to see whether or not gun ownership has a different effect, whether we're talking about Democratic lawmakers and Republican lawmakers. And I think, you know, that sort of gets to, I forget, either Jason or Nate were making the point that, you know, conceivably it depends on whether we want to see them as hypocrites or it matters whether they're seen as hypocrites, right? A Democratic lawmaker who owns a gun might be seen as a hypocrite, just like a Republican lawmaker who doesn't own a gun might be seen as a hypocrite. So, I mean, one of the suggestions is to look at that, and I haven't done that yet. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. In terms of the theoretical questions about what exactly causes this, I think my co-author and I tried to write it in sort of a general way to kind of hedge on that question, because of course we have no earthly way of disentangling what exactly causes this effect. So, we talk about a little bit about identity, a little bit about like the uniqueness of the gun culture. Obviously, we talk about descriptive representation, and maybe it has to do with the information that members, bring to bear on this issue. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on whether it's useful to kind of stake out a firm stance on we think it's X, or kind of go more general and say, it could be a range of these things and we don't know what it is, but they all sort of work in the same direction.
Okay. Let's move on to the discussion of theory. I don't know. We could certainly move and sort of move quickly through this if there's not a lot of commentary. I know there's a lot of thoughts on the design element, but are there sort of specific theoretical points that people want to make?
I've got one that goes at the question Jordan just brought up.
Okay.
That was a big question for me. Is why do you assume that gun ownership implies that I would not be for certain gun safety regulations? You're saying 90% of the public approved of expanded background checks. That had to include a large number of gun owners. I think more than 10% of the public owns guns. The thing I was thinking about is I eat meat regularly and I drive a car every day, but I'm very much in favor of regulations on the safety of those two items. So I don't know why that there's anything unique about. I think you need to develop why there's something unique about guns that would make me averse to any type of safety regulation on that product.
Okay. Neil or Barry, anything theoretical?
I think the theory and the design are like so tightly linked here. I'll wait for 1 second until there's some kind of pure arguments against that section of the paper that deals with theory.
Okay. All right. Well, why don't we do that? We can sort of combine that discussion. So, how about conversation about how about comments about the design? Neil, you want to start us off?
Yeah, so I'll start the conversation. So I'll be quick. So I think there's kind of 4 issues that came to my mind. So one is, and I think a lot of them are driven by this paper that I'm going to put in the link. So this is a paper by Laurent Bouton, who's an economist at Georgetown, and his colleagues. This is, I think, the best paper I've read on the topic, and it has a lot of implications for this design too. So one thing is that is an omitted variable in this paper the gun ownership in the district or the state. And that really what the individual member's gun ownership is proxying is just that a lot of people own guns in the state. And again, you might think that's a hard thing to measure, but this paper does very clever things on how to measure it. So for example, there's like gun magazine subscriptions that is publicly available data, and is tied to NRA membership rates. So then you can get a very good proxy of how many people are owning guns by subscribing to these gun magazines. And I think if your result survives the constituency level gun ownership, then it shows that there's like a marginal effect of the actual member owning guns. It's not just confounded. The second question I had on the design is to have at least one paragraph in the paper where it's very clear what's pre-treatment and what's post-treatment. And I am generally convinced that everything in the model besides the gun ownership is pre-treatment, and therefore the specification is not biased. But you would wonder. So, for example, Mitt Romney had this like famous moment in the debate where he tries to pretend to be a gun owner, like shooting varmints or whatever, right? And gun ownership is viewed as kind of a form of pandering on the right, that you kind of have to do it to pander. So, is it that does maybe owning a gun help actually increase the vote share or change kind of the constituency characteristics? The third question is, I'm very unclear on what the counterfactual claims made in the paper are, because the paper actually does a lot of counterfactual analysis. So the counterfactuals, it seems in the paper, is if you replace the entire person, right? You say, instead of having this white male who's owning a gun, let's put somebody else in the Congress. But at the beginning of the paper, the theory is about, let's have this same person and remove the gun out of their hands. And those are two very different counterfactuals. And you're trying to get at the first one, even though a lot of the stuff later on in the paper is about replacing a white male conservative with somebody else. But that has nothing to do with a gun. It has to do with replacing the kind of person that owns the gun. So what's the counterfactual? Is it actually holding and possessing the gun, or is it all of the correlates that come along with that type of person? And then I think the final thing I'll say is that, you know, the Congress scholars are more experts on this, but whenever somebody is predicting votes, like roll call votes, I find it much more convincing if you can use your variable to explain within party variation. So I would be like much more convinced by the results is if this explained variation like among Democrats or among Republicans, and you're kind of conditioning on party that way. Otherwise, there's like a bunch of functional form assumptions, even though what's mainly cutting people on these issues is party. So I don't know, there's some stuff to start the discussion on the design. But.
Can I weigh in on some of those things too?
Of course, go ahead, Barry.
So on the post-treatment question, it's a good one. One of the variables in Table 2 is gun pack receipts to the candidate. And in my book, I treated those as a dependent variable that was a reaction to the legislator's personal traits. So in the chapter I did on smokers in Congress, for example, it was as if the tobacco lobbies knew who the smokers were in Congress and gave them more money because they knew they would advocate for their interests. It's a really safe principal agent problem for them. I don't know if that's the right direction, but that was how I posited it. But here it's the other way around, or at least they're simultaneous. It's a little unclear, so I think it'd be worth working through some of that. I also wondered if the measurement of the prevalence of gun ownership is a little low. So you have the USA Today survey, and then that's augmented by your own survey. Very clever. This is one of the things I wish I had in the book was gun ownership. I thought about looking at things like gun permits issued by states or other things like mentions of having a gun in a campaign ad or on a website. Some members do that. But it seemed like you didn't combine all the data you could have combined. There's a footnote that says there are some members who didn't answer the survey but then said on the floor of the House they owned a gun. I think I would have called them gun owners. You know, they're in the public saying that, or somebody who said in a campaign ad, here's my gun, and you know, we're just very clear about that. But I think you set those aside, and so my guess is your 56 or 59% ownership rate is probably low. It's probably above 60. I don't know what that does to the results, but just as a descriptive matter, to say, wow, the gap between the electorate and legislators is bigger than we thought. So I have more empirical things, but there are just a couple things to piggyback on Neil's comments.
Okay.
Yeah, I just have a quick response. So yeah, in the footnote in the aggregate statistics, we did not include members who said in a floor speech or in a campaign speech that they owned a gun because we found no examples of the opposite. Members who said, clearly that they do not own a gun, but we actually did include those members in the analysis. We just didn't include it in the aggregate statistics because then it would bias the figure in the high direction because we don't have members standing on the floor saying, I don't own a gun. So it's in the analysis, but not in the aggregate statistics for that reason.
Okay, Neil, Barry, Jason.
There's one other thing to add there. When you do the predictions, you do the model to predict who owns a gun for both members and the electorate in the survey, and the estimates you produce come in lower than the observed prevalence. And I think the observed prevalence is a little bit low, but let's just take that as a given. You're maybe 10 or 15 points below what's actually observed. It suggests to me there are some covariates that are left out that predict gun ownership. And I know there are a couple you couldn't include because you don't have these measures for members of Congress. But it seems to me there must be a literature out there, maybe in sociology or someplace, on who owns guns. You have a Gallup poll that you use as kind of the basis of the models, but there might be something more sophisticated in the scholarly literature that you could draw on that would help fill out the models a little bit and get those predictions better, and that just makes the rest of the analysis fall more tightly from that point on.
I think that's right. You know, we searched for a number of different variables that we thought maybe would help us reconcile that fact. You know, we looked at, so there's a Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus. We looked at that to see whether that would clean some of this up, and you know, we've struggled to get those two to more closely align. I mean, the best that we can guess, and it's purely speculation, is that perhaps members of Congress are more likely to own a gun, despite what the estimates say, because they fear for, you know, their life. You know, there are certainly public safety issues that they confront that are unique. That's the only speculation that we have. I mean, you have, after the Gabby Gifford shooting, many members saying explicitly that they want to carry their gun in D.C. and on the floor of the House and Senate to protect themselves. You know, that's entirely speculative, but that's the best that we can do there. But the point's well taken.
One thing I think you could address is the agenda setting features that are going on. I mean, you mentioned this has become a heavily partisan issue, and I think you're dealing with a split Congress at this point. And so there's sort of an assumption there that there's a random distribution or anybody can make a proposal, and I don't think that's true. I mean, this becomes a problem, I think, in your counterfactual analysis. You talk about it, you know, we'd replace these people, something would have passed the House. Republicans are running the House, they don't want this to happen. It wouldn't have come to the floor if they thought it was going to pass the House. I mean, there's less agenda control in the Senate, but certainly I think you want to mention that this is not a randomly drawn subset of potential gun control measures that make it to the floor to get these votes that you observe.
I mean, I guess you know, one of the thoughts that I had, and you know, one of the things that a lot of people who've written on descriptive representation have looked at is, you know, sponsorship. So I think one of the next steps, I'm curious to hear people's thoughts on this, would be to see what bills members are sponsoring and whether there's some sort of effect of gun ownership on whether they're proposing a pro or anti-gun control measure, because obviously there are no agenda setting effects when it comes to bill sponsorship. So maybe that would help resolve that. It's just something I've been thinking about.
So I have a question that I could be wrong on this, so I'm happy for people to critique this. Okay, but there's two ways you can think of like an analysis. It's like in terms of beta or in terms of R squared. And when you're kind of looking at the marginal effect of owning a gun, that's sort of like a beta question. And I think the paper is on better grounds there. But when you're doing these counterfactuals, that's like more of an R squared type question. So I guess my reaction reading the paper is that I found these counterfactuals kind of unconvincing. Because, you know, if you have this counterfactual that, like, we just take out all these gun owners and you replace them, and remember, like, what the matching estimate would be, the matching version of it, is you have these guys are exactly the same. They're white males, they're conservative, except they don't have guns. And, like, if we do this, we will have, like, gun control legislation, right? So that's, like, a very strong claim that I believe depends on, like, this model explaining a lot of the variance. And moreover, it's sort of like a very static argument where, you know, in the real world there's probably going to be dynamics, right? Like these guys who don't have guns that come in, they're going to be pressured by the NRA, by interest groups, maybe like by some colleagues that have guns, etc. So it, like, the way the paper read to me was the pivotal legislator has a gun. If the pivotal legislator doesn't have a gun, then we can have gun control. And I find that to be like a very strong claim, which is like an R squared type claim, as opposed to the more modest claim, which is owning a gun increases your likelihood of voting this way on some legislation by some beta that we can estimate. I don't know. I'm not confident in that, my comment there, but I'm interested to hear what other people have to say.
I guess on both of these last 2 points, it felt to me as though the measure of the dependent variable was just thin. I mean, I think this gets to Jason's agenda point and Neil's point. In the House, you've got 1 vote. And so to base the counterfactuals that Neil's worried about on the 1 vote and try to simulate, the imaginary world where you replace the gun owner is tough. And I don't even know if that was a clean vote that was just on the gun measure and there wasn't other stuff attached to that. So I wanted to push you to make the outcomes richer. That could mean going back to Congress or forward to Congress just to get some more votes, even though you're going to lose some members in doing that. Or to do what I did in my book and move upstream in the legislative process to sponsorships, speeches, amendments, whatever. You get more variation, and it seems more genuine. And I found that personal factors mattered more upstream in the process than at the end, where partisanship and these other things come to dominate vote decisions. So I don't know if that helps your concern, Neil. Just sort of having more things to observe, more variation. Doesn't quite get around the agenda problem when it comes to votes, but I think looking at sponsorships is a little better, and it's a little freer environment than the floor.
Agreed.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, other design comments, or I guess we've sort of moved to the empirics already, but any comments on the empirics or design remaining? I
mean, could I ask a sort of a direct question?
Sure.
Would the 3 of you advocate that the counterfactual analysis towards the end of the paper be completely removed, or is it a question of simply acknowledging in the paper that this is an imperfect analysis, it's very speculative, there's a lot of variance and these kinds of outcomes? I mean, what would you do if this was your paper?
I mean, if I was like a reviewer for this paper, I'll be able to share what everyone else has to say, but I mean, if I was a reviewer, my reaction is that is so speculative that I view it as unhelpful. And part of the beginning of the paper has some of these flavors too, which is, right, if like the model to predict gun ownership is not well explained, like for the general public, kind of then, applying that to the Congress is going to be messy. So I don't know, my recommendation would be, like, the JOP has this new like 10-page paper section. If you can get like the middle part of the paper, which is like this beta question of like whether this personal characteristic of the legislator affects their behavior, whether on the roll call votes, also the stuff that Barry was talking about, and you can kind of nail some of the potential confounders like the gun ownership rates in the district or the state, I think that would be like a great like 10-page JOP style paper. And then like you're very confident in that. Whereas if this kind of like 30-page version of the paper induces stuff that I think like are more easy targets, as opposed to kind of a clean, I'm going to focus on just kind of how personal characteristics affects behavior, without much of this kind of huge speculation on like the reason we don't have gun control is because members have guns, And that's like a different claim than just saying simply, owning a gun, just like having a daughter, like affects how you do your job, and the decisions you make on the margin.
I agree with Neil on that. I found that part of the paper less persuasive, and you wouldn't hurt anything by taking that out, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'd let Table 3 go, and I might let the Newtown framing go, and sort of get it away from the current events, specific bill types of things, and double down on the stuff Neil's mentioning about trying to get measures of what's going on in the districts, whether it's gun ownership, magazine subscriptions, or whatever. You might be able to use some post-stratification stuff, the Mr. P approach, to get some district or state level estimates that would be helpful. When you're doing these forecasts, the simulations, there's so much uncertainty around them that I wouldn't trust the simulations anyway, to just say, this vote flipped. Maybe, maybe not. But the effect I trust more.
Okay, well, I mean that's very helpful. I appreciate that. I mean, I guess one thing. So Nick Carnes, this approach came entirely from his book White Collar Government. He does the same thing, simulating what if we had fewer millionaires in Congress? Would we see different outcomes on things like the Bush tax cuts and other economic proposals? But I think everything that you've said I know, but it's good to hear people say, yeah, it's not convincing. It detracts from the main hook of the paper. So thank you.
Okay, any back end comments? Sort of, Barry, you had some stuff you were going to wait on, but I might have pulled you out. I pulled those in early.
Couple of things. If I was a reviewer, one thing I'd want is a table of descriptive stats. I don't know, for example, what the distribution of gun pack money is among members. So to be able to assess that, I mean, you find particular effects, but I need to know, is that 3 members who are getting a lot of gun pack money and nobody else? Just that's sort of helpful background. The one bigger thing I'd put either on the front of the paper or on the back is to think about how this gap in prevalence that you find of gun ownership, which is about a 20 or 30 point gap between the public and members, how that compares to other gaps. So sort of going beyond the gun case to think about, there's some, I looked at some in my book, but there are other studies on the religions of members of Congress. There are a lot of studies like that. Race. There are places where the gap is big, and that's sort of the level question. But then there's the effect question. So there may be a big gap, but it's not consequential. And so you try to do both those things. Or there may be a small gap, but it's really consequential because it's strongly correlated with preferences in some way. And so just sort of where do guns fit on those two continua? Right? I think the gap is pretty big, probably larger than other characteristics we've looked at in the literature. The effect size, I don't know whether it's big or small compared to others, probably in the ballpark. But it's those two things in combination that tell you whether this issue matters or not, or whether some personal characteristic matters. So I think, again, I'd sort of peel away the Newtown current events aspect of it and the specific bill simulations and try to put it in this broader context, so even people who don't care about guns, but care about representation and trying to have a framework for that, would have that to walk away with.
Okay.
Other big picture or straggler comments, Neil or Jason?
I mean, the last thing, just to reiterate something I was brought up before, that the paper I posted finds that this stuff is very heterogeneous among the parties, right? Kind of like it's sort of like the Republicans are just doing what the Republicans want, but a lot of this explains kind of the Democratic behavior a little bit more. So, like, I think you should pursue that, like, who's actually marginal. And at least the paper I sent you argues that it's the Democrats that are really marginal on this gun control issue, that are really affected by these kind of constituency pressures, like very acutely. So, I'd be curious if you had the data right now. Just to kind of say, like, if you split the sample by Democrats and Republicans, what happens?
Mm-hmm.
One other small thing you might do is look at senators who are up for re-election versus those who aren't.
Yeah, sorry, just interrupt. That's what that paper does too.
Oh,
and
good.
It's similar to your work, Barry, as well, even though the other side. But like, it really does show that it's this kind of late term in the Senate terms effect where this is. Sorry to interject, but yeah.
No, that's great. It sort of gets to Nate's comment about hypocrisy. Are members voting in this way because they learned something about the value of guns? Or are they voting because of their self-interest, or are they sort of pandering to constituents? If you could set, you only have 80 senators, so you may not have the power to do this, but if you could break it out, you might be able to get into those questions a little bit.
Great.
Any final thoughts? Jordan, any last comments before we sign off?
No, I think this has been incredibly helpful. I think a lot of the suggestions are things that will definitely improve the manuscript. You know, I'm thankful for everything that you guys have had to say. It's a good thing that the summer's coming up, so that I have plenty of time to do all of these things. But no, I appreciate this very much. I think that everything you've said is on point. Yeah.
Okay. Great, guys. Thanks for signing on. Everybody watching, thanks for joining us. Jordan, thanks for putting your paper up for discussion. I think this is the final LSVW of the year. Anyone that's watching or any of you folks that were on the panel, please point out that we're going to be doing it again next year and looking for papers to discuss, looking for panelists. So spread the word, and look forward to seeing you back next year.
Thanks, Nate.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks everybody.